It is the Awesemo NBA Live Before Lock Sunday afternoon show. Not exactly sure how many people we're going to have in here, but everybody does show up. We greatly appreciate you because we have a football slate going on. Not particularly a good football slate for me individually, but definitely a football slate going on. And then we've got NBA preseason contests a little bit smaller today compared to the other slates. And I'm kind of curious to see if that's going to hold up or if we're going to get some bigger ones going forward, because they were pretty big the first couple days and then they got smaller, but it's hard to know if that's because that's generally what happens with preseason or if it's just the nature of it being a football Sunday and there's other stuff going on that people are more paying attention to. Guys, as we get started, don't forget, give us a thumbs up, like the video, subscribe to the Awesemo Podcast Network, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Adam, how are you doing? And is your football Sunday going better than mine?
I'm not really sure because my cash lineup had a lot of guys in the late game. So I think I'm doing okay. Like hopefully coming in somewhere around even, which is for how this NFL season's gone, a win. So yeah, I don't really know yet, but I guess, excited to move on and talk about some NBA on a Sunday, which is a little unusual.
Yeah, and I mean, thankfully we'll only have, a couple of Sundays to do this, and then we're actually getting into regular season NBA, which I'm very pumped up for. And speaking of regular season NBA, it's almost starting. And for $1, if you use the promo code Caruso, you can get NBA access through December 29th for Awesemo. This gives you access to everything we offer for our NBA preseason DFS. And for the first season of regular season action, this includes projections, ownership projections, our Slack chat, lineup builder, and much more. So sign up today. That's only $1 using the promo code Caruso. Good way to try out the product. So one thing that's pretty interesting about this preseason slate is this is the first time we're seeing teams play their second games. So I think that something that I'm going to be paying attention to is, how much different are we going to expect rotations and lineups to look from game one to game two? So I think that's a good question to start with. Adam, how much weight are you putting into what we saw from the first game into these second slates for some of these teams, like the Magic, the Hawks, the Knicks, all teams we've seen play? What do you think is going to be different or the same this slate?
Yeah, so I mean, 5 of the 6 games are the second game of the season or second game of the preseason, and I think it's you should put a lot of weight into it. It's almost like as someone who has to go through and try and find tweets from beat writers and coaches and stuff. It's almost like a sigh of relief once you get past that first game and you get into the second and third game, because there is still certainly some guesswork and some reading into what coaches say, but you at least have something that you can go back and look at and say, like, this is what they did. As opposed to kind of saying, like, just flat out, I have no idea, this is what I'm guessing, and kind of moving on. Like, you can look and say that we know that Tom Thibodeau ran his rotation like it was the middle of the regular season, and he's apparently just still Tom Thibodeau. Like, so you can just you can have at least a little more confidence. Like, whereas we talked about the Knicks prior to the first game, and like when the subject of Julius Randle came up, it was kind of like, okay, well, we don't have any sort of report on him. There's certainly a chance that Thibodeau just runs him into the ground right out of the gate. Now we know that he did that. So you can have a little bit more confidence that those guys are going to play bigger minutes. And then also on most teams, maybe making exceptions for teams like the Lakers, for example, you can kind of assume that the regulars are going to play at least a few more minutes than they did their first time out.
Yeah, and then that'll also be interesting because we have, LeBron questionable, Anthony Davis questionable, to see if the Lakers are actually going to play those guys today, because they didn't in the first game. The first game we actually have on the slate, and oh, by the way, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, because Drop Roses is in the YouTube chat. Congratulations on the Drew Lock Day. He's been waiting for this for I think like 2 years. The world's biggest Drew Lock fan. He is really the only person commenting in the YouTube chat, just all capital letters Lock. He's very excited. Drew Lock with a big fantasy football day.
I'm there with him. I have him in one of my Wildcat best balls, but I think I'm also playing against Derrick Henry, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, my best ball teams are all screwed. Although I did have Josh Jacobs in one of them. It appears he is playing after pretending he wasn't on Instagram for whatever reason. First game on the slate, we have the Orlando Magic taking on the Atlanta Hawks. It looks like both teams are going to be running out the same starting lineups they did from the first game. Starting with the Orlando side, they are starting Markelle Fultz, Evan Fournier, Dwayne Bacon, Aaron Gordon, Nikola Vucevic. The players that are ruled out are Terrence Ross, Al-Farouq Aminu, and James Ennis. From the Magic side of the game, and the other thing that's also kind of interesting about this slate, a lot of the pricing is the same as it was the first slate we saw these guys play. So sticking with a guy who I liked from the first slate, Markelle Fultz, who I think is going to be a pretty decent per minute fantasy producer this year. I think he's viable at a fairly cheap price. And then Nikola Vucevic, we saw play, fairly substantial minutes relative to preseason. He's a guy who's also not overly expensive. I think he makes for a really good pay up option. If I remember correctly, on the first slate with the Magic, he was somebody who we thought of as the best option to pay up for at center. And it ended up being that was the case. Of the things that we got right and wrong, there was plenty of both. Vucevic was one of the things that we were on the right side of. So how do you feel about the Magic, and are you willing to go back to pretty much the same guys?
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the safer teams, one of the more appealing teams on the slate, because while in game one they did run a pretty deep rotation, they gave a lot of minutes to their main guys, with the exception of Aaron Gordon, which they had said before the game he was going to be limited to 16 minutes. Haven't seen a quote about his minutes today, so maybe it goes up to like 20, 22, something like that. But the rest of these guys, Vooch, Fultz, Fournier, all played 25 minutes. Michael Carter-Williams played 25 minutes off the bench with 13 field goal attempts. That's not something that is, I think, super surprising either. Like, he's with the second unit, he's going to get plenty of shots up. Cole Anthony took 10 shots as well. So I think looking to basically those same guys is a good way to go. Whereas someone like Dwayne Bacon had a good game, shooting 6 for 9 from the field. I think in tournaments, maybe pivoting to Cole Anthony, who only shot 3 for 10, or to Carter Williams, who shot 4 for 13, is probably a good way to go. Just, kind of chasing the bounce back performance. As far as, cash games and optimal lineups though, I think Vooch, once again, is one of the best plays on the slate. He's cheap. You're expecting, 25 to probably like 27 minutes. It's a good spot. Fultz, like you said, is cheap and playing plenty as well. So I think Orlando's one of the teams you can feel pretty confident in their main guys.
Yeah, as it goes for Aaron Gordon, unless we get an update on his minutes, I'm pretty comfortable avoiding him, because he played, very limited minutes, but he still did very well in the limited amount of time he was on the court. So I think a lot of people will look at what Aaron Gordon did in the first game and be like, oh, Aaron Gordon was good. He's only 6,600. I want to roster him again. And I think there is a case to roster him if he's going to play the same minutes as the other starters. But if it's another situation where he plays, 16 to 18 minutes, then I don't really think you want him, because I just don't think he's going to be able to replicate that kind of production in the limited minutes he played last time. He was incredible in short minutes in the first game, though.
Yeah, agreed. And the price point is kind of tough too, because, like, for example, on DraftKings, he's $100 more than Julius Randle, who, I don't know, might play like 48 minutes tonight. Like, but I mean, you're expecting probably at least like 5 or 6 more minutes for Randle. It's not like he's a bad point per dollar player, and that's just one guy. You have all these different guys that that you can switch to. Like, it's because of it being preseason, you have the stars, their salaries are kind of flat. Like, the stars' salaries come down, the minimum salary is 4K instead of 3K. So it's even harder to go to mid-range guys if you don't think they're going to play a lot of minutes, because they sort of have to produce at a similar per minute rate to the actual stars.
One thing I think is pretty interesting as we transition to the Hawks side and their starting lineup: Trey Young, Kevin Huerter, Bogdanovich, Collins, and Capella. Trey Young, if I remember correctly, was the highest owned play on the first preseason slate. He was just under 70% in most contests. Didn't necessarily kill anybody's lineup, scoring like mid-20s points, and there was enough value that it worked out. But with that said, I think enough people rostered him and were disappointed with his output. I wonder if his ownership is just going to tank. I think that a lot of people who rostered him in the same matchup, game one, are probably going to be a little hesitant off him. I think people will chase points and just be like, hey, I want to roster John Wall for $500 more because he scored more fantasy points in the first game. So what do you think people will do with Trey Young? It's obviously really hard. It's preseason to predict ownership. We don't have ownership projections or anything like that, but my gut feeling is that his ownership is going to dip in a pretty significant way.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's relative. Like, I don't think you're going to suddenly get, like a 10% owned Trey Young or anything like that. But I know in some contests on Friday, he was like 78, 79% owned. And I really thought that he was one of the best plays on the slate. So even if he comes down to 55, 60%, that would give you a pretty sizable advantage, to roster him. And I think that it's really important. I know you and I kind of mentioned it yesterday when the subject came up, but you can't just look at how he played and say, oh, we were wrong, shouldn't have rostered him, bad play, whatever. He played 22 minutes, which was maybe a couple minutes less than we were expecting. Still shot 9 times, had 6 assists. He turned the ball over 6 times and he only made 2 of his 9 shots. You're still talking about Trey Young. He's a really good passer. He's going to pick up assists. He's obviously one of the best shooters in the league. And if he goes from 22 to, let's say, 25 minutes, it's still a really high upside spot. There's nothing really to take away from Friday that makes Trey Young look any worse than we expected. I don't think he just played poorly.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that makes him a little bit more advantageous also his price dropped because of his fantasy point production. He was, I think, 87 or 8,500 if I remember correctly, and he's 8,200 now. So you get a little bit of savings there that makes him a little bit more appealing. The guy who I think on a points per dollar basis is actually the best play in Atlanta. I like Clint Capella at 5,300. He only has center eligibility, so that gives him a little bit less flexibility, but still a guy who's been a really good per minute fantasy producer for his career. I think going forward, it's going to be interesting to see how he meshes with John Collins and how that's going to impact the fantasy production for both of them. But still, with that said, 5,300 for Clint Capella. He's a point guard in Trey Young that he can run the pick and roll with. So I think that he's going to be able to have a lot of the same success in Atlanta that he had in Houston with James Harden. So I think at 5,300, Clint Capella is probably one of the better mid-range to cheapish value plays.
Yeah, and I think it's good too that he played 20 minutes in that first game because he was questionable coming into that game. There was kind of some speculation that maybe you would see like 15 to 16 minutes. So getting 20 minutes from him, I think, was a really good sign. I wouldn't expect him to go backwards. I don't know if he picks up more minutes or not, but even if you're getting 20 at that salary, it's good. The only thing that makes it tough is that you do have Vooch. I don't want to use the word lock because I don't think that's really ever accurate, but you have Vooch, who is very, very clearly a great play at 7,400. And then you still have these cheaper guys, cheap center options you can go to, like Rashawn Holmes, for example, who played, I think, 27 minutes on Friday. So it is still a really tough position, I think, to allocate exposure to anyone basically not named Vucevic. But that being said, you probably should be rotating through Capella in tournaments because he is cheap. And if you can get 20 minutes of greater than a fantasy point per minute from Capella, that is going to be useful.
And there are some players out here too. We've got Chris Dunn is out, Rajon Rondo's out, Tony Snell is out, and Cam Reddish is out. Cam Reddish, the big one, because he played a significant chunk of minutes in the first preseason game and also played pretty well. He produced. So I think that could open up a little bit of value. I mean, obviously, this isn't like a regular season NBA situation where it's all of a sudden like, hey, now there's this guy who's stepping into 30 minutes and all this usage or anything like that. But I do think a little bit opens up with Reddish being out. Is there any individual player that you think stands to benefit the most without him?
I think that, with it being preseason, you probably just kind of see more minutes allocated to other guys off the bench. But, Reddish did play 23 minutes. So I would think maybe you see a little bit more run for Skylar Mays, who only played 6. Maybe Brandon Goodwin picks up a little bit more. Typically, he's just going to back up Trey Young, but, maybe gets a couple minutes alongside of him. I don't really anticipate any one player. Like, I don't think there's going to be anybody who wouldn't be a play who becomes a play because Cam Reddish is out.
One thing to add is the original starting lineup I saw for the Hawks had Bogdanovich starting, but actually looks like Hunter is starting at small forward and not Bogdanovich. Let's see the price on those guys. Hunter 5,100. That's probably a little expensive for him. Kevin Huerter starting at 4,800. Maybe he's okay, but nobody that really screams as a value play.
So same starting lineup except Huerter in place of Bogdanovich.
Yeah. So it's Young, Huerter, Hunter, Collins, and Capella. Does that change anything for you at all?
I think it makes Bogdanovich a little bit riskier just because you don't know exactly what the minutes will look like. But at the same time, anytime he's playing with that second unit, it's going to be really valuable for him. So I think that it doesn't change too much. But as far as like a tiebreaker goes, if you're, playing cash games or something like that, him coming off the bench potentially could make him a little bit riskier.
All right, next game. And this is probably the game that I'm most excited for in the preseason so far. Not that that's saying much, but it's the Nets and the Wizards. Maybe you're excited for a different reason than me because you get to watch your Wizards play running out what you called is basically the same lineup they ran out for the second half of last season. And going up against the Nets, it's the debut for Kevin Durant. Him and Kyrie Irving, both active, both starting. I think that's pretty cool. I'm interested to see what Durant looks like coming back from the Achilles injury. And I kind of have a feeling Durant's going to be really good this year. I know the narrative has always been, or I wouldn't even call it narrative, just the correct information around Achilles injuries have generally been that guys could come back and be good, except they're a lesser version of themselves. But with that said, I don't think the Achilles injury is quite as severe as it used to be. We don't necessarily have as many NBA examples, but if you look like Breanna Stewart in the WNBA, her first season coming back from a torn Achilles, she won the finals MVP. She led her team to a finals championship. And then we've seen in the NFL recently, Richard Sherman, he tore his Achilles. He came back and was a top 5 cornerback in the NFL. So I don't necessarily say that means it's a lock that Kevin Durant's really good, but I think he has a much better chance of returning and being closer to the MVP level than players who tore their Achilles a couple of seasons ago were in this kind of situation. So what do you expect from Durant, and do you have any kind of feel for what kind of production he's going to have this season?
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested, I guess, to see how it goes. The good thing is, he had plenty of time off since he ended up sitting all of last season. And, to your point too, obviously it's one game, but like even John Wall actually looked explosive. And that's someone that I was very concerned about, what he would look like coming back. So, hopefully he comes back healthy. He did have, plenty of time off. So excited to see how he looks. As far as it goes for tonight, I think it's gonna be tough to trust much of anything from the Nets, just because, you do have Durant, who missed all of last year. You have Kyrie, who missed most of last year with injury. So I wouldn't expect those guys to be seeing heavy minutes in their first game back.
Yeah, I definitely don't think they're going to play heavy minutes. I'm not really actually interested in a fantasy perspective in a Kevin Durant or Kyrie Irving. It's more just as a viewer perspective, and then just kind of seeing, hey, what does this guy look like? What can we expect from him to start the season? And then one other thing I'll add about the Achilles injury that kind of makes me interested is I was doing promotion for DraftKings on when I was working for them on an ESPN LA radio show with this guy, Dr. Clapper, who's an orthopedic surgeon who also has like a fantasy football / fantasy basketball show. And we were talking about Achilles and ACL injuries. And he was telling me that in a few years, we're going to get to a point where an Achilles injury is like month to month. And he said guys are going to tear their ACLs. And it's going to be a week to week injury where the surgery is going to get so advanced that we're moving in a direction where it's going to be much less serious than what it's thought of as now. And I just had that in the back of my mind for a little bit. And that's something else that kind of leads me to think that I don't know exactly, like I'm no surgeon or anything like that. I don't have any real information in that field, but it does make me think that we are going to start to see guys with a pretty good chance of returning from these serious injuries in shorter time periods and looking closer to their former selves than they were before. So Kevin Durant, I'm pretty high on him relative to other people entering the season, but as it goes for tonight, it's hard for me to really draw interest in him. I very highly doubt that Kyrie Irving or Kevin Durant are going to play, north of 20 minutes in their first game back after a while. Is there anybody else on the team that stands out? And then one other thing to mention is that Karis LeVert is out tonight.
Yeah, LeVert's out. So I think if you're looking to this team, kind of just looking for upside in tournaments, Dinwiddie is pretty interesting. On DraftKings, he's only 5,600. If you go under the assumption that Durant and Irving aren't going to play a ton of minutes, maybe Dinwiddie does play a little bit more than them, and he would be the primary guy here. So I do like the idea of, kind of taking some shots at him. Beyond that, I'm not too interested in Brooklyn. I'm not too interested in this game really from a DFS standpoint, because it is the one game on the slate where we don't really have a firm grasp on what rotations are going to look like. Both teams have plenty of players, even with the guys that are injured. So there's nobody that looks, really great for me from the Brooklyn side.
Yeah, I agree. And then the other thing to consider too is even in limited minutes for Durant and Kyrie Irving, they're going to take a lot of shots. Like they're going to use up the usage while they're on the court. And the issue then with just rostering them is, the price tags. Kyrie Irving, 8,100, Kevin Durant, 8,600. I'd rather roster somebody like Trey Young, who we talked about in the last game, or some of the other high-priced options in the other games. Then moving on to the Wizards side, we don't have a starting lineup for them, but what we do know, Bradley Beal is out. Davis Bertans is out. Jerome Robinson is out. Ish Smith is out. Russell Westbrook is out. Thomas Bryant is a game time decision. Considering that everybody else is out, I would tend to think that he ends up sitting as opposed to playing also. You are the resident expert on the Washington Wizards. So with that in mind, which guys do you kind of think will start and potentially put up some value?
Yeah, so I'm expecting Troy Brown, Rui, Lopez, Neto, I guess, with Ish being out and with Westbrook being out. And then probably like Bonga would be my guess. It's the thing with Washington is that even though they're missing all these guys, they still have 14 or 15 healthy bodies. So it's still going to be pretty easy for them to not, push anyone too much. And the pricing is also elevated a little bit on guys like Troy Brown. He's up at 5,800. That's someone that I would normally be really interested in, but not quite as much here just because the salary did go up. So I think that there's still a pretty good chance that none of these guys play huge minutes. I think that someone like Rui probably leads, like Rui and Troy Brown probably lead the team with like 22, 23 minutes played. And that makes them okay in tournaments. But I think that there's just more safety.
One note I did see is that Denny, and I'm so bad at pronouncing his last name, first round pick, Avdija, I think is how it's pronounced. He's expected to play around 20 minutes. So he was somebody that I was kind of interested in before I saw that note. Cause I don't know, 20 minutes for a rookie making his preseason debut. I think that's probably a little bit steep of a price tag. It's not like he's flat and in price of 4,000. I think he's priced up to 4,900. So I think that makes him a little bit tougher to trust. As for some of the other Wizards guys, I agree with you on Troy Brown Jr. 5,800 is pretty steep price. Gary Matthews at 4,000 is pretty interesting to me because we saw him put up some value at times during actual NBA games last year. Not afraid to shoot, decent 3-point shooter. So he's somebody that I'd look to as probably a tournament option that I doubt is going to pick up much ownership. I don't think people are going to Gary Matthews. As for other guys, maybe Rui. If Thomas Bryant actually does end up starting, do you think you would be interested in rostering him?
I don't think so. I think the bigger impact for Brown would be if he is, or for Bryant would be if he is out. Maybe you can look to Mo Wagner at 4K. He's always someone that produces well on a per minute basis. He just fouls a lot, but that doesn't really matter in the preseason. And if you take Bryant's minutes out, I think that, like I'm not expecting Robin Lopez to play a bunch of minutes. So if Bryant's not out there, I think it makes it pretty easy for Wagner to start pushing like 20 to 21 minutes.
Yeah, and to somebody's comment in the YouTube chat about how could they have this many healthy bodies? He doesn't think the Wizards are that many healthy people. This isn't like NBA regular season where it's a 12-man roster. The preseason rosters are pretty substantially big. So even with all these guys out for the Wizards, there's still, I mean, what's the actual number? It's still about the size of a regular NBA roster just because of the size of the expanded rosters.
Yeah, exactly. That's why like yesterday it was so weird that Oklahoma City only had 11 or 12 guys, but they were missing like 8 or 9. The Wizards aren't missing that many.
Yeah, and then a lot of their starters, even with that many guys out, they still only kind of played a lot of their starters the first half.
Right.
Like SGA, I saw in the first half, it was like, oh my God, SGA 25 fantasy points at halftime. He's going to absolutely destroy the slate. And he just didn't play in the second half. So it was
Right.
like he was still good for his price tag, except he just didn't play in the second half, even with everybody out. Anything else you want to add from the Washington side of this game?
No, just keep an eye on the Thomas Bryant news.
Yeah, I've been looking for news on Twitter as we have been going along. Next game on the slate, the Pistons and the Knicks. This was a game that delivered a lot of fantasy upside in the first game of the preseason. Another reason that we don't have a lot of lineups for these games is the other slates we've had have started at 7 o'clock, and then there's been games that also start at 7 o'clock. Today, this slate starts at 5, and then we have games that run until 9 o'clock. So these games with some of these later spots, we're not going to have starting lineups for a very long time, and that's going to make it kind of hard to make decisions on those games. With that said, the Pistons and the Knicks, I kind of assume they're going to run out the same starting lineups they did in the first game, and that was for the Knicks. I'll start with them. They started Alfred Payton, Alec Burks, RJ Barrett, Julius Randle, Nerlens Noel. To your point before, Tibbs plays every game seriously. Even if it's a preseason game, he's still playing guys somewhat decent minutes. So with that in mind, I think that we have to consider a lot of these guys to be seriously decent plays. Alec Burks, RJ Barrett, Julius Randle in particular, I think he's going to be maybe the chalk of the slate, and for good reason. He played a bunch of minutes, played really well in the first game. Nerlens Noel at center. I think it looks like he's going to be the Knicks starting center this season, unless they do something like start Mitchell Robinson tonight. But if that's the case, I think Nerlens Noel also a viable play because he's a really good points per minute producer and not all that expensive. Do you agree that the Knicks are probably the best team on the slate to target?
Yeah, just because we've already seen them play close to what like most teams in a normal preseason in their final game or two they start pushing 30 minutes. Here you had Barrett and Randall both play 29, Peyton played 27, Noel played 25. They only ran an 11-man rotation despite having a million other guys that they could have played. So unless we get some news before lock that Thibodeau just decided, had a change of heart and isn't going to do what he always does, I'm treating this like it's going to be more of the same. And the salaries on these guys are still really affordable. Mentioned it earlier that Randall's $100 less expensive than Aaron Gordon, who played 16 minutes last game. Peyton only 6,100. RJ Barrett 16 field goal attempts. I think you were, even though he didn't have a great game, I think you were right on that one when you said you liked him a lot on Friday because he came out there, he played almost 30 minutes and he shot the ball 16 times. So I think going right back to him is really strong as well.
RJ Barrett is so terrible right now. It's so ridiculous. I mean, it's a preseason game, so it's whatever you play guys who are going to get minutes and take shots. But some of those shots he was taking, he was not even close. I think he had more shots he airballed than made in the first half. He had shots that were going off the bottom of the backboard, were missing everything. So it was pretty brutal to watch. But even with that, it's kind of encouraging because it it didn't stop him from shooting. Like he was nowhere near the mark on a lot of them. It didn't deter him. He kept firing it up. So that is kind of something I like to see from preseason NBA, because when we're comparing to other guys who it's like, hey, this guy's going to play 16 minutes and maybe he's a better basketball player than RJ Barrett, but Barrett's going to go out there and he's going to play for our fantasy teams. He's a guy who's out there to score fantasy points and take shots. So I think all these guys are strong options. I'm curious, do you have any takes on Obi Toppin? Because of the players who actually look good for the Knicks, he played 20 minutes, scored efficiently off the bench. It's just a little hard for me to say that, Tibbs, who's always had this idea that he doesn't really like to play his rookies all that much. And then Obi Toppin, who actually looked good in the first preseason game, but Tibbs only gave him 20 minutes. What do you think we see from him here? Do you think there's a chance that he gets bigger minutes in the second game?
I think there's a chance he gets bigger minutes, as in, plays a couple more minutes. I think that he's someone that you can look to in tournaments. It's not someone I look to in cash games, just because I think that there's guys that just project for more minutes. Even on the other side of this game, you have Blake Griffin at basically the same price point, who played about the same minutes, and obviously he's Blake Griffin. So it's not someone that I'm going to prioritize in any sort of optimal lineup, but I do think he at least has the offensive game that he can outperform that salary if we do get a couple of extra minutes there. I think it's fine. It's clearly a secondary play for me though.
All right. One thing, guys, also please do us a favor and like the video. We've only got, 35 likes on the YouTube show right now. So give us some likes, help us out, because who doesn't like preseason NBA action? This is what everybody should be going crazy for, is for the for preseason. And also one other thing is I did just get a note from News God, who said that Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving will each play 20 minutes, which was about in line with what we were expecting from them. But yeah, please do us a favor, like the video, subscribe to the channel, helps us out a ton. The Pistons side of the game, I think somebody you mentioned there that definitely bears talking about, Blake Griffin, who looked really good in the first preseason game, which in hindsight probably shouldn't have been a shock. I mean, if we just think about it, Blake Griffin was cheap, and he's still a good permanent fantasy producer, even if he's a guy who we're probably not expecting to be quite as dominant in the regular season he's been in the past. In hindsight, I think it was probably a little silly to just glance over Blake Griffin at such a cheap price. So looking at him at around the same price point, still too cheap for Blake Griffin. I think he's one of the better value plays on the slate.
Yeah, I agree completely. He came out and, he looked aggressive. For 22 minutes, he kind of flirted with a triple double, 9, 7, and 5 line. Only shot 3 of 11, 2 for 7 from 3. So it's not like he was efficient, and he still put up a solid line. Still really cheap. I think that he's someone that you can definitely be building around tonight.
Yeah, and then the other thing too is, I mean, you look at who the Pistons started last game: Killian Hayes, Delon Wright, Jeremy Grant, Blake Griffin, Mason Plumlee. So you just think about that lineup and it's like, all right, where's the usage going? And it just kind of makes sense that Blake Griffin's going to have the ball in his hands a ton. One, be willing to take shots, and then two, also being somebody who's willing and able to facilitate, because if not him, who is it going to be? Ultimately, I think Killian Hayes is probably going to have a pretty good rookie season and will take on a lot of that role. But at least for now, he looked, a little bit overwhelmed at times during his first game. He ended up turning the ball over, it was either 6 or 7 times. So it's mostly going to be the Blake Griffin show in Detroit, and the pricing just didn't really adjust much at all from the first slate. So Blake Griffin, I definitely think, is a priority play for me here. Killian Hayes, I'm still willing to go back to him. I know he struggled with the turnovers, but he also made some plays, right? Got some rebounds, some assists, was willing to take shots. So I think he's okay, but I'm probably not as high on him as I was on the first slate. Are you willing to go back to Hayes?
I think in tournaments, because people probably will shy away. You saw he wasn't as highly owned on Fridays as I expected him to be. I think part of the reason for that was because of the news that Vooch was going to play a lot. It sort of just changed the way roster construction looked. You also had the cheap centers with Holmes and Cantor, but then he played poorly. He turned the ball over 7 or 8 times. So I think that people probably shy away, and I don't think he's necessary. Like, now that we know how many minutes the Knicks played, we know how many minutes Orlando played. It's not someone that I'm prioritizing over, like, for example, Markelle Fultz. I just think he's going to play more minutes. But if you're expecting, let's say, 22 to 24 minutes for Killian Hayes and then like 25 or 26 for Fultz, and a lot more people are going to play Fultz, that's a spot where Hayes is going to win often enough, I think, that it's a viable pivot.
And then anybody else on the Pistons you think is worth mentioning? To me, it's mostly Blake Griffin, with maybe a little bit of interest in Killian Hayes. One thing I'll mention, one other player I'll at least bring up, Jeremy Grant did shoot a ton, was incredibly inefficient, made 1 of 11 shots, and mostly mid-range jumpers, which is a little bit concerning. It kind of feels like the Pistons have the second coming of Josh Smith on their hands by giving this big contract to Jeremy Grant. Except the difference is that they're actually paying Grant more than they paid Josh Smith, which is crazy to think about in hindsight, given that Josh Smith contract was so bad and he was on the books for so long. But Jeremy Grant, after he took 11 shots, are you willing to go to him or not really?
Not really. I just the thing is like the usage is certainly nice, and he came to the Pistons expecting a bigger offensive role than he could get in Denver, but he's never really shown that he's a great offensive player. So I'm not sure exactly how much, increased usage for Jeremy Grant actually translates into more fantasy points. So, he's someone that if this were like the regular season and there were stars that we needed to pay for at $11,000 and Grant's coming in at 4,900, having shot 11 times last game, I'd be more willing to take a chance on him. But, here there's so many guys in this price range. Like, why aren't I just playing Blake Griffin?
Yeah, definitely. I agree. I think that of the plays on the slate overall, Pistons, Knicks, just like we said the other day, I think this is a game that we definitely want to target. We know the Knicks are getting big minutes. The Pistons, it looks like there's a couple guys who have favorable price tags. So it's a spot to look at. Knicks game on the slate, Chicago Bulls, Houston Rockets. The Houston Rockets are a pretty interesting team to talk about because we have John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins both coming off significant injuries and both looked pretty good. Definitely better than I think anybody expected in the first preseason game. And then once again, we have James Harden out. We have Christian Wood out. PJ Tucker's out. I think it's going to be a really interesting situation also in terms of what do the Rockets do with their starting center situation in the regular season. If Christian Wood, let's say whatever, he struggles in the preseason or remains out with elbow injury and Boogie keeps playing well, do you think they'll start them together? Do you think they'll go with Boogie over Wood? They just paid Wood a decent amount of money.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think they'll play them alongside each other. I'd be kind of surprised. I mean, either one of them really could come off the bench. Like they both provide scoring with the second unit. So I think it probably will end up coming down to kind of what fit they like with, Harden and Wall and more so like kind of a personnel thing.
Yeah, and then also assuming that Harden is still there. I also wonder with Harden he seemed it's hard to say exactly, except at least it seemed from the media talk that he wanted out of Houston. I know it's just a preseason game, but with still little talking points on the slate, I think it's worth bringing up. Do you think that seeing how good Wall and Boogie looked relative to expectations would make Harden a little bit more apt to want to stay in Houston?
It can't hurt. Like if you just, put yourself in that position, if you're Harden, Westbrook's gone, you kind of, the team never made a real title push and, now you want to go play somewhere else. But then you see, like if you brought peak, prime John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins in and paired them with James Harden, you'd be talking about another super team. But because they're both coming off of substantial injuries, that hasn't been the talk. So I mean, if you're Harden and you're watching that game, I doubt that he just completely did a 180 on how he feels. But I'm sure I would think that he's happy with how it looked, as opposed to if John Wall still looked like he did in his Olympic team picture and was coming out there barely able to move.
One thing that I did think, at least from some of the highlights and the few plays I watched from the Houston game, they looked like a really fun team. I mean, I think you can make a case that a revitalized John Wall and DeMarcus Cousins that are motivated and happy to play together because they were, best friends back in Kentucky. Even if Harden goes somewhere else, this is probably going to be a team to watch on NBA League Pass. It's going to be a team to pay attention to. They're going to be fun as long as they stay healthy.
Yeah, I mean, as a Wizards fan, like I'm happy with that trade. I'm glad that the Wizards got Westbrook, but I am a little bit jealous because for as long as I can remember, we've had that narrative where Wall's going to talk Boogie into coming to DC and they're going to pair up, and it never happened, obviously, and now it happens in Houston. So I think it does have the potential to be really fun to watch.
All right, and then one thing I'll also say about the Rockets starting lineup is last game they went with John Wall, Eric Gordon, Ben McLemore, Jayshawn Tate, and DeMarcus Cousins. In terms of minutes, do you think we're going to see about the same from Wall and Cousins? Do you think they'll ramp them up a little bit? Because one thing that is interesting about the last game, at least, is they're both really good per minute fantasy producers. And if they do get a little more minutes at their price tags, I think John Wall is probably a little bit too expensive. But even DeMarcus Cousins at, what was his price? 6,000. That's a little more expensive than he was before. But I mean, if he's going to be the guy who averages, 1.4 fantasy points per minute or something like that, if he's going to get over 20, I think he's a viable play.
Yeah, no, I'm still expecting relatively limited minutes there. Like, I think it would be really weird if they just push Cousins and Wall here. They played about as much as I expected them to in the first game. Maybe see a couple more minutes here. Boogie did put up a solid line with 14 points, 5 rebounds in only 15 minutes. Like we know he can be a monster on a per minute basis. I'm just still not sure that it's possible for him to get enough minutes right now to be someone that I really want to roster. This team in general, I think the minutes were really flat last game. They played 16 guys. The only guy who played more than 20 minutes was Bruno Caboclo, who played 26 minutes, played really well, 17 points, 7 rebounds, 3 blocks. I think that's someone you can look to if you expect that he's going to get substantial run off the bench again. But just the way that they use this team and how many guys they played and how flat their rotation was, I think it's really difficult to trust too many of these guys when you have other teams playing, 5 to 10 more minutes for their main guys.
All right. And then from the Bulls side of the game, their starting lineup from the last game, we don't have a starting lineup for them here either, which, like I was saying before, it's one of these cases where this game is an 8 p.m. start time. So the game starts in 3.5 hours. And that's going to be an issue with a lot of the later games that we've got. They all start 4 or 5 hours from now, the other one. So it's going to be tough to get information at this time of the day. Bulls last game at least started Kobe White, Zach LaVine, Otto Porter, Lauri Markkanen, Wendell Carter. I think that of these guys, LaVine is probably the play that makes the most sense to pay up for. Although if I'm comparing him to Trey Young, I think Young is the better pay up option. It's going to be tough to trust Otto Porter because I don't think he's going to be getting a ton of minutes in the preseason. Kobe White, who ended up being a pretty strong play in the first preseason game. I don't like his price point now because he's become more expensive. And then Markkanen, Wendell Carter, to me, they're just kind of whatever. There's nothing here that I think looks really all that great. Are there any plays to you that you really think stand out?
I'm really interested in LaVine in tournaments. I thought was a really good play last slate, and he started out really well, scored 21 plus points in the first half, finished with 21 plus points. So was, disappointing, but played 23 minutes. And I'm kind of interested in what his ownership ends up looking like because it's going to be really easy for people to shy away from him in favor of plenty of other players on this slate. But if he even gets 2 or 3 more minutes and you start talking about Zach LaVine playing 25 or 26 minutes on a preseason slate, potentially, this is someone that can go out there and just, absolutely nuke a slate. So I think that he's not optimal, but I think that he's one of the first guys that I would look to if I'm trying to find someone that does have a really high ceiling and isn't likely to be, one of the highest owned guys on the slate.
Yeah, I think to me, Wendell Carter is like moderately interesting. The issue I have though is just the players he's priced around, right? So like Nerlens Noel is less expensive than he's 4,900. You get Blake Griffin for 5,200. So on a points per dollar basis, I think if you need somebody put in like your utility spot around that salary, I think Wendell Carter is viable. Just the problem is that there's a lot of centers around that price range that I think are slightly better plays.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it goes back to, in part, at least to your point about, or what you had said earlier about the contest being smaller. The smaller a tournament is, the less you need to kind of get off of the optimal plays, or the optimal plays are kind of, the normal path. Not to say that Carter is too far off, but when you're talking about Vooch, you're talking about Holmes, you're talking about Cantor, you're talking about Randall, having center eligibility. Like there's a lot of plays here, Collins as well, that just look really good and are probably going to play a lot of minutes.
One player I think we probably should talk about in this game before we move on, and it's being talked about in the YouTube chat a little bit, is Bruno Caboclo, who did have a massive game in the first game of the preseason, ended up being a guy who at low ownership won some GPPs. Here's the issue I have, though. He's been priced up to 5,200 after he scored 17 points and played 26 minutes in the first preseason game. I feel like he's going to be overowned now. And maybe I'm reading into that too much. Maybe people aren't box score watching that much for preseason, being like, I need to roster Bruno Caboclo now. But I feel like at 5,200, like Blake Griffin's the same price. I'd rather roster him in that same price range. There's other guys I like here. I don't necessarily want to chase fantasy points from Bruno Caboclo. Or do you disagree and just think, hey, Bruno Caboclo is the truth? And he is, as somebody in the YouTube chat is saying, he's actually the next Giannis. So where do you stand on Caboclo?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with you. Like if he were still close to min salary, it would be a good value. Where he's at now, he still obviously has the ability to pay off that salary. He just did it last game, but there's no guarantee that you get 26 minutes from him again either. And if let's say he only plays 21, 22 minutes, it starts to become really hard for him to, be in a winning lineup. So I think that it's kind of a thin play, and I'd rather just be going to some other guys.
All right. The next game on the slate is the Lakers and the Clippers. The Lakers situation is pretty tough to figure out right now. The game starts in 4 hours, and we have LeBron James, Anthony Davis, KCP, Marc Gasol, Alfonso McKinney, and Markieff Morris all listed as questionable. So it's like almost every important player on the team we're unsure if they're going to play. One thing that is noted is that at practice on Saturday here, this is per the Lakers screen and roll account on Twitter. Lakers head coach Frank Vogel said there was only one player on the team that he'd for sure decided would not play against the Clippers. That was Alex Caruso, who, by the way, if you use the promo code Caruso, you get access to all of our NBA stuff through December 29th for $1. So that is a good promo code to try out. So Caruso, he's out, but everybody else, it looks like, is questionable, and they really have no clue whether they're going to play these other guys or not. So I don't know what to make of the Lakers at this point in time. Montrezl Harrell played very well in the first preseason game. If LeBron and AD are out, it stands to reason that Harrell is a viable option. I just don't know what to make of a team that has like 8 core players listed as questionable.
Yeah, exactly. And it obviously has a big impact. You know, you got 31 minutes from Harrell, you got 38 minutes from Kuzma. The Lakers played 9 guys. The only player who played and did not play at least 23 minutes was Caruso, who only played 10. So essentially they played like 8.5 guys. If they're going to do the same thing, then obviously the Lakers become one of the most appealing teams on the slate. The problem is that we're not going to have that news. So in tournaments, it's going to be really tough, because the thing is, these early games, we talked about the first couple games on this slate where we have a really good feel for how they're going to play and how many minutes these guys are going to play. So you want those guys in your lineup, but at the same time, if you can find a way to leave some flexibility to late swap later, you can potentially give yourself an edge if the Lakers do sit more guys. You would have Harrell and Kuzma and Horton Tucker, who played 37 minutes, all potentially being really, really good options. The problem is just if the Lakers do play a few of their guys, then pretty quickly you start to lose value there.
So I think this is something we should mention too, is with all these guys being listed as questionable, how are you considering that when you're going about building lineups? To me, I think number one, and this is just a general point of strategy that I think needs to be mentioned for NBA anyway, and for people that are new to NBA or maybe just need a reminder from last year, don't forget to put your players that start in the later games, put them in the guard, forward, and utility slot, especially for preseason. You're going to want to have the flexibility. So that's one thing that I definitely think needs to be said. But outside of that, some of these guys, like, what are you doing with these situations, and how are you utilizing flexibility in late swap?
Yeah, I mean, on this particular slate, a lot strategy-wise for me will depend on what format I'm playing. So, like on Friday, in cash games, I tried to leave open a couple of spots because we were waiting on some news for cheap plays from the Lakers and the Kings. So I tried to leave open a couple spots, but we also didn't have quite as much of an idea of what the minutes were going to look like for early guys. So kind of a different approach for me on this slate. I'm going to lean towards, in cash, I'm going to lean towards kind of known commodities, and I'm not going to worry so much about leaving those spots open because I don't want to forego a really, really good play from like the first game on the slate just so that I can find out that the Lakers are going to play their whole team and I don't have anywhere to go there. But in tournaments, you can kind of do the other thing. Like if, for example, just, kind of the first name that comes to mind is like Elfrid Payton at 6,100 or and even better. So RJ Barrett at 5K. Like, I think he's a great play. I'm playing him in cash. There's no way I'm not. But if he's going to be way, way higher owned, I would think, than a $5,100 tail in Horton Tucker, because we have no idea what the Lakers are going to do. If the Lakers were to sit their guys, then Horton Tucker becomes just as good a play as Barrett. So in tournaments, you can kind of, it's worth it to look for opportunities where you can take that risk. Whereas in cash games, I would much rather just take the known commodity in Barrett.
One update that I think you would like to know, if you weren't already aware, on the Packers opening drive, Devontae Adams had 60 yards and a touchdown. So I was very happy to see that. That brings
70%.
brings a little bit of sunshine to the day for me. Definitely locks up some min cashes, which is very exciting. Final game on the slate: Portland Trailblazers against the Sacramento Kings. Once again, no starting lineups for these games. Starting with the Kings side, Marvin Bagley and Hassan Whiteside have both been ruled out. Kings starting lineup for last game was De'Aaron Fox, Buddy Hield, Harrison Barnes, Nemanja Bjelica, and Rashawn Holmes. I think Holmes makes for a pretty good play. We talked about him a little bit on the first slate of the year, and his price at $4,600, I think that's really cheap for a guy like him that's generally always been a good per minute fantasy producer, and the Kings already without 2 of their key big men. So Holmes is the guy that I'm really focusing on here. He's somebody who I think is probably going to be somebody that I want to be on regardless of what the starting lineup looks like.
Yeah, agreed. 27 minutes last game. He averaged 1 fantasy point per minute last year. And it wasn't even really surprising that you got all those minutes last game because the Kings last preseason came out of the gates, pretty much playing their starters a bunch of minutes as well. So I'm not even really concerned about him taking a step back. I think that he's a really good value. The only problem you really run into is that he is the position that he plays. Like, for example, I'm kind of flipping a coin right now between like, do I want Rashawn Holmes or do I want Markelle Fultz? I think they play similar minutes. But I think Holmes is one of the best plays on the slate.
We do have a Nets starting line. Not a Nets, a Wizards starting lineup, by the way. Washington is starting Neto, Brown, Avdija, Rui, and Thomas Bryant. So Bryant is in. So circling back to the Wizards, how do you feel about the starting lineup?
Makes me less interested in the Wizards. Like, I was kind of hoping Bryant would sit.
And also exciting news is that apparently Russell Westbrook is not likely to play in any back-to-backs this season. So there you go. More exciting news for you as a Wizards fan.
Great. Part of the reason that I was happy for the trade was not having to deal with Wall missing half the games.
Wouldn't it be really funny if Wall's just healthy all year now and just it's like a total non-issue?
That's generally how DC sports work. That's been my entire experience as a fan. So wouldn't be surprised.
So something else from the Kings side of the game is I think that De'Aaron Fox is a very viable option. The question then becomes is how does he rate in compared to some of the other high-priced options on the slate? For me, I actually think he's the second best third best pay up option. Trey Young 1, Vucevic 2, and then De'Aaron Fox 3. Do you agree with that, or do you feel way differently?
Yeah, no, same 3 for me.
Cool. Good to see that we're on the same page with games that are very difficult to predict and don't really matter all that much. Any other players from the Kings that stand out to you?
Harrison Barnes played 29 minutes. Take that for what it's worth. It's still Harrison Barnes, but 29 minutes from him is someone you can certainly plug in tournament lineups and then just kind of either play him or play something that opens up from the Lakers, for example, later on in the night. He's someone that like if you get stuck with Harrison Barnes, it's not the end of the world. Buddy Hield 17 field goal attempts in 23 minutes. Another guy that I don't think is going to make optimal lineups, but clearly has a high enough ceiling that he'd be a good guy to roster in tournaments.
And then from the Blazer side of the game, Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, Derek Jones, Robert Covington. Those were 4 of the starters last game. Jusuf Nurkic is considered questionable to play right now. So I assume that he would start at center if he ends up being active. Zach Collins is out. Rodney Hood, also a game time decision. He is also another player coming back from a torn Achilles. From the Blazers side of the game, Damian Lillard, pretty expensive. And the issue I have with him is, as he said to the media, is he expects to be play limited minutes pretty much throughout the preseason. So with that in mind, I think he makes for a pretty weak play compared to some of the other pay-up options on the slate. CJ McCollum also way too expensive for me. The Blazers are a team I don't really have much interest in.
Yeah, I don't have a ton of interest. I do think it's worth pointing out that Lillard played 22 minutes. I think that was a little bit more than I was expecting. So if him being limited means he's going to play 22 and then, I don't know, 23 or 24 minutes, he's at least, got a chance to put up a really big score, but, still you have enough other guys on the slate that I'd put ahead of him. Harry Giles had a monster game. Obviously the minutes for Cantor and Giles are going to be impacted by what happens with Nurkic. If Nurkic is out, these are 2 guys that you could definitely take shots on in tournaments. As far as cash games go, I'm not going to bother with either one because of Nurkic. I can find plenty of other, cheap options to go to instead.
All right. So that's going to take us through all of the games. If anybody has questions in YouTube chat or in Slack chat, you could message me and I'll stall some time so we could wait for those to come in. Any other final total thoughts on the slate? It is really hard to get too much information because we have, 4 starting lineups and a bunch of these games don't start for 4 hours. So it's hard to really get a lot of info, a lot of questionable players. So any thoughts before we wrap up?
I think it's important. Just pay attention, again, to the contest size that you're playing. There's enough really good plays on this particular slate that in smaller field stuff, I don't think you need to get that cute. Like, you don't need to be digging, 13 guys deep from a team to try and find someone that's going to have their best per minute production of the entire season tonight, when you can just move, 1 or 2 guys beyond the optimal and do well in contests of this size.
So let's do a quick game with some time left. Let's say favorite value option and favored pay up option for guards and then big man position. For me at guard, my overall favorite value option is going to be RJ Barrett. I liked him the other day, like him a lot for the same reasons. We've got Tom Thibodeau willing to run his guys out basically forever in a preseason game because he has to win every game at all costs, which I'm sure will propel the Knicks to the 7th overall pick in the draft this year, which will be very, very exciting. But anyway, RJ Barrett played big minutes in the first game, ended up taking 16 shots, like you said. I think that kind of minutes and usage is very valuable in preseason. So who's your favorite value guard?
Yeah, I'm with you on Barrett. I'll throw Bogdanovich in there too. I double checked. One of the Hawks beat writers said that Bogdanovich is playing. He's just coming off the bench. So I was slightly concerned when he didn't start, just because it's the preseason and weird stuff happens. But he did say that they're just trying to get a different look at potential units. So I do still like Bogdanovich a lot.
All right. And then pay up guard for me, it's going to be Trey Young. And the hope here is that the ownership comes down in a significant way from the 70-ish% that he was owned on the first slate of the season. For a lot of the reasons he was a good play in that game, in that slate, I think he's a good play on this slate. It's the same matchup. The price is cheaper. The minutes are relatively secure, at least in reference to what we expect from preseason, what we get from other players. So Trey Young, I think him with his price down a little bit makes for a good pay up option. There's a reason that he was chalk on the first slate. And I don't think we should really change our views on him that much because of one mediocre preseason game.
Yeah, agreed completely. I'll throw, you mentioned him earlier, but De'Aaron Fox in there. He did play several minutes more than Young did on Friday. Young played 22 minutes. Fox played 26. So, maybe you do get a couple more minutes again from Fox, who is a very high upside player as well. So, both of those guys are guys I'm more than happy to pay up for.
All right. And then somebody in the chat here is asking any other small forwards that we like other than Barrett. I'm just going to go really quick to see who the players are that are specifically small forward eligible. Off the top of your head, is there anybody who's at the small forward position that you like a decent amount other than RJ Barrett?
Buddy Hield at 6,900. Again, not a cash play, but someone that you can look to in tournaments because he's going to shoot a ton. Harrison Barnes is boring as hell, but played 29 minutes and he's 5,300. The small forward position is pretty weak though, and didn't take too long into the season to get to that point.
Yeah, and already in mid-season form. One other play I'll bring up is Obi Toppin, and I'm just going to mention a lot of Knicks players here because I think this is the best team to target on the slate because Tom Thibodeau is the only coach who's running a short rotation for the preseason. So Toppin, who looked pretty good, Knicks first-round pick in the first game of the season, came out fairly high usage, was willing to take shots. I think that he's somebody who could have another decent game in the preseason. And I also think there's a chance that he plays a little bit more minutes. Big man value play for me. I'm going to go with Blake Griffin. Price is just too cheap for a guy like Blake Griffin, who when you look at the other players who the Pistons start, I think he stands to have a pretty big playmaking role, soak up a lot of usage. And he's just a really good per-minute fantasy producer and a very proven commodity for a guy who's that cheap in preseason DFS. He played really well in the first game of the preseason, and they just didn't adjust his price at all.
Yeah, I agree on that. I think that Richaun Holmes at 4,600, 27 minutes, he's a point per minute performer, and his salary didn't come up either. You can throw Nerlens Noel in there also.
All right. And by the way, one thing I think is really funny is people give me a little bit of crap in the YouTube chat for pronouncing rookies' names wrong. I'm going to pronounce a lot of rookies' names wrong, particularly the foreign players. Not that Obi Toppin is a foreign player, but it is what it is. And then eventually I'll hear them say the name a few times on the broadcast and I'll continue to get it wrong. And then eventually over time I'll get it right. And then all will be okay in the world. Pay up option in terms of a big, I'm going to go with Nikola Vucevic. Played well against the Hawks. I think we could pencil in most of the Orlando starters for around 25-ish minutes. That's what we saw from him in the first game. That kind of playing time for Nikola Vucevic, that's more than enough for him to go off and have a big game relative to his price.
Yeah, without question. You could certainly make the case that you want to pay down for like a Richaun Holmes or an Nerlens Noel and then go to like Trey Young plus De'Aaron Fox. I don't think that's a problem, but I think Vooch, in terms of like an optimal lineup, is one of the first guys in for me.
And mentioned in the chat from El Negro Loco, Nerd Ass Greg can't be pronouncing names wrong. You can be rest assured that Nerd Ass Greg could pronounce plenty of names wrong because one of the many weak points that I have is foreign accents and just foreign players in general. So I think that it's going to take me a while to get some of these players' names right. Like Poku on the Thunder, that's going to be an absolute disaster. By the way, if you saw his low light reel from the other night, Adam, it was hilarious because he had a pretty good fantasy game, and it was somebody that you liked also. But his bad plays were really bad. He had like a couple of airball layups, but he was he was going pretty strong. He was playing for our fantasy teams for sure the other night.
Who was that?
Poku, the Thunder forward.
Oh, okay, got it.
And then, so who for you is your favorite big man to pay up for?
Yeah, it's Vooch. Certainly Collins and Randall in the conversation as well, but Vooch is the first one.
All right, so I'm going to scan the chat, see if there's any final questions. Let's see. Is Lauri Markkanen a good play? He's a little overpriced, in my opinion. I don't think that is somebody that I'm willing to go to. He is over 6,000. The price was, what's the number? 6,500 for Lauri Markkanen. I think that's a little rich for me to pay for him. What about you?
I agree with that too.
All right. Any final? No, it looks like those are all the questions attached. So guys, that is going to wrap up the show. Please do us a favor, thumbs up, like the video, and subscribe to the YouTube channel. Subscribe to the Awesemo Podcast Network as well. And that will do it for the show. Jordan, you could play the music out.